It's 11 p.m. in the middle of a western summer. The outside temperature is still stuck at 95 degrees. Millions of air conditioners are screaming to keep these massive cities afloat in the desert. That survival seems obvious until you realize this entire network is suspended on a wire, nearly 300 miles away. Forget the disaster scenarios on television. There will be no explosions, no crumbling concrete walls, and no impending flood. This wall will stand. This isn't a prediction. This is reality. But the real disaster isn't the sound of crumbling concrete. The real disaster is the silence. Deep inside this concrete mass, the sound of the turbines is beginning to fade. The water in Lake Powell is plummeting toward a boundary the government calls the minimum power pool, the minimum power generation threshold. The problem isn't that the reservoir is completely dry. The problem is that the water is no longer high enough to create the necessary pressure to keep the turbines spinning. If Glen Canyon loses this thrust, it will enter a state of functional failure. A billion-dollar structure will still stand there, but it will no longer be able to do what it was designed to do. 40 million people depend on this system. And the most terrifying question now isn't when the dam will collapse, but rather, what will happen to the entire West when its life-pumping heart begins to stop beating? To understand why the 490-foot red line is so frightening, you have to look back at how the American West was built. They didn't build these megacities on desert sand. They built them on stored winter. Every time you turn on the air conditioner in the sweltering summer heat of Phoenix or open the tap in Los Angeles, you're actually consuming snow that fell months earlier on the distant Rocky Mountains. The snow melts into the Colorado River, then collects at Lake Powell. Powell isn't just a simple reservoir. It's a giant water battery. It stores the melted snow, then releases it through the Glen Canyon Dam to generate flexible electricity for millions of people, while also sustaining the downstream dam, Lake Mead. But this battery is running low. The plummeting water level leaves a white marble scar that exposes the shortage. The problem with the minimum power pool is that it's an optical illusion. When you pierce that red line viewed from above, the lake still contains billions of gallons of water. It wasn't completely dry, but deep inside the concrete, the pressure had died. It was a functional failure. The minimum power pool wasn't the point where Lake Powell disappeared. It was the point where the belief that the system was still functioning properly began to disappear. If Powell was the battery, why couldn't it be recharged? The answer lies hundreds of miles from the dam, high in the Rocky Mountains. We often have the illusion that water flows from a tap, but the true rhythm of the Colorado River begins with the snow. Snow accumulates throughout the winter, freezes on the mountain slopes, and then slowly melts in the spring to create the flow that nourishes the entire basin. But that circulatory system is breaking down. Upstream snowfall is now only 23% of its average. The problem isn't just that there isn't enough rain. The problem is that even when it does snow, a warmer world is stealing that water before it can reach Lake Powell. Hot air is drawing moisture directly from the ice. The water that does melt encounters an extremely thirsty land surface. The dry, cracked soil devours the surface water, and the vegetation drains the rest. Data shows that for every degree Celsius increase, the Colorado River's flow decreases by 9%. The same amount of snow from 2 decades ago no longer produces the same amount of water flowing into the lake. This isn't a drought. Droughts are temporary cycles. Things dry up and then get wet again. What the West is experiencing is Aidification, a structural change that plunges the system into the worst super drought in 1,200 years. Nature is shrinking, but is being forced to comply with a delusional dividing line. Back in 1922, when nature dried up, the West was bound by a historical mistake, the Colorado River Treaty. 7 states sat down to divide the river's flow. On paper, everything seemed perfect. They assumed the river would carry 16.5 million acres of water annually, enough to fuel any urban ambitions. But there was a fatal truth. The 1920s were actually a rare unusually wet period. Thousands of years of tree ring data exposed this illusion. The river's actual long-term flow was only 12 to 13 million. From the moment they signed, the West had been dividing up a water supply that didn't exist. They had built an entire civilization on an imaginary river. This tragedy gave rise to the concepts of water on paper and real water. For decades, massive reservoirs like Powell masked that fundamental deficit. When the water level plummeted, the naked truth was revealed. The right to use the water remains in the safe, but the actual water in the lake is evaporating. On paper, the river has enough water for everyone. In reality, the flow has never been as great as the contract promised. When ownership rights crush the last drops of water, the battle begins. The question is no longer who was promised what. The most brutal question now is, who will have their water cut off first? The crisis didn't start with dry taps. It started on the power lines. The Glen Canyon Dam wasn't built to provide continuous base electricity. Its true power lies in its flexibility. It's an invisible battery, a rapid response force for the entire system. In the power grid, energy sources aren't equal. Solar power dies prematurely at sunset. Wind power is dependent on nature. Gas plants start up too slowly and are too expensive. But hydropower is different. In the middle of a scorching summer afternoon in Phoenix or Las Vegas, when the sun sets but temperatures remain dangerously low, millions of air conditioners roar simultaneously. The grid is stretched taut. At that critical moment, engineers simply open the floodgates. In an instant, the water pressure rushes down the turbines, pumping hundreds of megawatts to save the grid, preventing the entire system from collapsing. If Lake Powell breaks below the red line, the West won't just lose power. It will lose its only shield during peak hours. There won't be a complete blackout. Instead, the first signs will be less dramatic, but more devastating. Electricity will be more expensive, the grid will shake violently, and the system will no longer have any safety buffer to withstand another heat wave. But electricity is only the first piece on the chessboard. But the power grid was only the first domino. When that domino faltered, it crashed down on a massive victim hidden in its shadow downstream. Many mistakenly believe Lake Powell and Lake Mead are two independent lakes. In reality, they are two levels of the same system. Powell holds the water upstream. Glen Canyon Dam releases water through the Grand Canyon directly into Lake Mead. There, the Hoover Dam takes over pumping life downstream. In a closed system, the law of survival is brutal. When Lake Powell receded to the red line, the managers were forced to make a bitter decision. Hold the water upstream to protect the Glen Canyon turbines from destruction. The price? Lake Mead was cut off from its vital supply. When the flow from Powell was choked, the water level at Mead plummeted. The domino effect continued. Hoover Dam lost its hydrostatic pressure. Risk assessment data indicated that Hoover Dam faced the risk of losing up to 40% of its design capacity if water levels dropped significantly. It was a cruel paradox. To save the upstream dam, they were forced to weaken the downstream dam. This is why Lake Powell cannot be understood alone. When it weakens, it transmits that enormous pressure down to the Hoover Dam, directly impacting Las Vegas, Phoenix, and the Californian countryside. And when the engineering impasse begins, the real political battle starts. When the technical system crumbles, the final mask falls, revealing a brutal battlefield. The Colorado River is divided among 7 states. But these 7 states do not live together in a single reality. The upstream group, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, sits right at the source of the melting snow. They argue that they are always at direct risk from nature, and most importantly, they have never used up the enormous water quota promised on paper since 1922. On the opposite side are the downstream, California, Arizona, and Nevada, home to the most water-hungry megacities and agricultural empires. They depend entirely on the lifeblood of Lake Mead. But even within the downstream, injustice stifles negotiation. California holds the ultimate priority water right, automatically safe. Meanwhile, Arizona is always the first to suffer when the water recedes. When water is abundant, historical agreements can mask conflict. But when the water reaches the red line, it turns into a life or death battle. Each state has the perfect reason to refuse to sacrifice. They all talk of a crisis, but each faces a completely different catastrophe. The water crisis is no longer a hydrological problem. It's a brutal question of power. Who has the right to hold back? Who must back down? And who will be cut off first? As Lake Powell recedes below the red line, it leaves behind more than just a white marble scar. Beneath the lake's surface, the sandstone canyons of Glen Canyon, submerged half a century ago, are slowly rising. The receding water exposes the cruel decisions the system once tried to bury. One of them is the forgetting of history. While 7 states argue over who gets cut first, some communities have been thirsty since the dam was built. In 1922, they divided the river, completely excluding the indigenous tribes. Today, tribes like the Navajo Nation hold 20% of the basin's water rights. But this is where the tragedy of water on paper becomes most apparent. Despite holding ultimate hydrological privilege, without pipes or pumping stations, that right will never translate into a drop of water from a tap. This massive system was designed to pump glory to the cities while neglecting the true owners. Nearly 30% of Navajo families now lack access to piped water. They have to drive dozens of miles, carrying plastic tanks under the desert sun to get the water that belongs to them. Having the right to water is not the same as having water in your house. And when a river is drained, that cruel difference is the boundary of survival. But the injustice doesn't stop there. The most devastating question is, from whom will the system continue to take? When it comes to wastefulness, all eyes turn to Las Vegas, a dazzling metropolis in the desert. With countless fountains and opulent casinos, it seems the epitome of excess, the drain on Lake Mead. But the truth is quite the opposite. Las Vegas isn't the culprit. Thanks to a law banning the planting of grass and a system for recycling every drop of wastewater from homes, its water consumption has dropped to record lows. The city even spent $1.5 billion installing the third straw to the bottom of Lake Mead. Even as the lake approaches its dead pool, this pumping station will continue to draw water. But this perfect preparation exposes a harsh truth. If a wealthy metropolis with cutting-edge technology and the strictest water conservation laws in America still trembles before the depletion of its reservoir, what fate awaits the rest of the West? Las Vegas demonstrates a frightening limitation. Even the best water conservation efforts are meaningless when the very river that forms the basis of the river is shrinking. Cities may dig deeper, but they don't drink the river dry. The biggest consumers of water, in fact, are not the cities. The Colorado River's water doesn't disappear in urban showers. Nearly 80% of that water flows directly into the ground. Welcome to the Imperial Valley, California, a verdant kingdom in the arid desert. Here, it holds ultimate power. Water priority, surpassing all megacities. The people don't waste water. They provide winter crops for the entire United States. But paradoxically, most of the water isn't used for human food. It's used to irrigate alfalfa, an extremely thirsty animal feed. They're not breaking the law. They're just clinging to a historic permit signed centuries ago. To save the reservoir, the government resorted to a drastic solution, paying hundreds of millions of dollars to farmers. To stop cultivating, society had to buy back its own livelihood by letting the fields dry up. But when the plows sit idle, the supply chain immediately crumbles. When saving water means abandoning production, the crisis is no longer confined to remote valleys. It's making its way to the supermarket. Cities need drinking water. Dams need water for electricity. Farms need water to sustain their economies. All demands are reasonable, but the fundamental river is depleted. The last vestiges of safety in the West are crumbling. We often imagine collapse as a moment of utter disintegration. But the real crisis on the Colorado River doesn't work that way. No single domino can bring down the entire West. Disaster only occurs when all the dominoes tilt in the same direction. Look at this chain reaction. Less snowmelt, Powell's water level dropping to the red line, Glen Canyon losing its leeway to save the grid. Water releases are being choked, dragging Lake Mead and the Hoover Dam into a spiral of declining performance. At the same time, scorching heat waves are driving electricity demand to its peak. Farms need water to sustain their supply chains, just as cities need water to survive. And at the negotiating table, states remain deadlocked over long-term rules beyond 2026. The term engineers fear most now isn't running out of water, but the disappearance of the leeway. The grid and reservoirs are still functioning, but the buffer zone that would allow them to withstand another dry winter, an extreme heat wave, or a political misstep is gone. The West isn't just lacking water, it's running out of the buffer zone that would allow it to make mistakes. This isn't just the fault of a dam. It's a devastating collision between a 20th century system and a 21st century river. Archring data shows this land was once ravaged by ancient superdroughts, but today's tragedy unfolds in a hotter world, burdened with tens of millions of people, blazing megacities, and vast agricultural empires. History warns that every complex society crumbles when water disappears. Look back at the Glen Canyon Dam. It was once a proud symbol, proving humanity could harness nature. But now, the river itself has changed. Glen Canyon doesn't need to collapse to send a warning. It just needs to be silent. And in the fading sound of its turbines, the American West will hear what the river has been trying to say for decades. The old world no longer has enough water for its old promises.